I did not move a muscle when I heard that the atom bomb had wiped out Hiroshima. On the contrary, I said to myself, unless now the world adopts nonviolence, it will spell certain suicide for mankind, said Mahatma Gandhi, one of the greatest heroes who ever lived. Imagine this. 225,000 people are killed and wounded in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 58,200 American soldiers die in the Vietnam War while fighting for the United States. Unfortunately, these are the consequences of military power over diplomacy to solve political issues. Using hard power causes violence and bloodshed, which are shown in many horrific wars in addition to the ones mentioned. My name is Brandon, my partner is Alex, and we proudly stand in affirmation of today's resolution. On balance, diplomacy is better maintained peace than military power. Soft power is evidently preferable as it focuses on using attraction instead of violence. Hard power costs innocent people's lives and essentially uses violence and power to force people to agree with you. Contention 1. Soft power is much more effective as it uses attraction and tries to reshape the ideals of other countries. From a logical standpoint, instead of forcing someone to see something the way you do, it seems a lot wiser to persuade a country by showing them the legitimacy of your perspective. According to Joseph Nye, a former dean of John Kennedy's School of Government at Harvard University and a major proponent to the idea of soft power rests on the ability to shape the preferences of others. He also goes on to mention political leaders have long understood that power comes from attraction. So improving a nation's schools, institutions, and infrastructures all display soft power. A classic example of American soft power is the Marshall Plan. After World War II, the United States pumped billions of dollars into war-ravaged Western Europe to prevent it from falling to the influence of communist Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan included humanitarian aid, such as food and medical care, expert advice for building destroyed infrastructures, such as transportation, communication networks, and public utilities, and outright monetary grants. As we can see, soft power is an effective, simple, risk-free solution to any problem. Contention 2. Hard power costs innocent people's lives and takes advantage of other countries' fear. Gandhi stated, "Nonviolence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It is mightier than the mightiest weapon of destruction devised by the ingenuity of man." Indeed, this is true because not only is soft power simple and effective, but hard power has egregious consequences, such as examples stated before, and many others too, such as the Gulf War, which killed 20 to 35,000 people. Evidently, this is not the way to solve problems. In addition, hard power uses force and intimidation for others to see something your way. So even if no violence is used, hard power is a form of bullying other countries by using their fear to your advantage. Gandhi summarized it clearly and concisely when he stated, "I object to violence because when it appears to do good, the good is only temporary. The evil it does is permanent." Indeed, this makes sense because even if it seems like you have successfully solved the issue in the short term by using violence, in the long run, it can cause other violence and worsen country relations. For example, the Cold War didn't cause extreme bloodshed, but it caused other proxy wars, the most deadly being the Korean War. More than 33,000 Americans and over 110,000 Chinese died in the war. So Judge, think about this. Do you want a world with constant destruction, innocent people getting killed, countries taking advantage of their power, and countries continuously being at war? Diplomacy is a much more humane solution that is shown to be more effective. And according to Lao Tzu, an ancient Chinese philosopher, water is the softest thing, yet it can penetrate mountains and earth. This shows clearly the principle of softness overcoming hardness. For these reasons, we urge your pro-ballot.
Would you like us to go to the middle for cross-ex too?
Yes, I do. You ready?
Yep.
Okay. Come towards the middle, but.
Yeah.
Cross-sex starts now.
So you said that there were 225,000 people wounded or dead in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Has another nuclear bomb been used since?
No.
In the 75 years between, has another nuclear bomb been used since?
Yes.
Which one?
I'm not sure. There was.
So you're saying, sorry. So you're saying that another nuclear bomb has been used since Hiroshima or Nagasaki?
I can't think of any examples. Why?
No, I'm just asking, was there or was there not?
I don't think so.
You also said that that diplomacy is much more effective. So say if a country or even a non-state actor did not want to cooperate, did not want to use talks to negotiate, how would you use diplomacy then? Would you force diplomacy onto them?
Well, you could do that, which is coercive diplomacy, which I have evidence for, but also you can use attraction, which I explained in my first
Right,
presentation.
so tell me how you would attract ISIS and get them to stop the bombing other people.
But that's such an extreme example. For ISIS, no matter what you do, you're not going to stop them.
Right, so military power, so what you're saying is that military power doesn't work against ISIS either, and that ISIS is just something that's completely unstoppable and everyone's going to be dead.
Not everyone's going to be dead, but it is hard to stop, and I don't believe hard power would solve it either.
Okay, so we have an unsolvable problem on our hands. So could you elaborate more on the point that soft power, political leaders understand that soft power comes from attraction?
Well, I explained in my contention that like if someone admires your country's like schools and infrastructures and all that, then they're going to want to emulate you.
Okay. And do you happen to know how much the Marshall Plan cost in terms of money-wise?
No, I'm not exactly sure.
Judge ready? Partner ready? Opposition ready? Judge ready?
Yep.
Okay, time will begin now. In 2014, 32,765 people were killed because of terrorists, and this has only risen today. The main reason for this is because diplomacy is simply ineffective alone, and force is necessary to prevent the deaths that occur and lead to a safer world. This is why we negate the following resolution. On balance, diplomacy has better maintained peace than military power. The goal of the negative is to have a framework with the optimal use of military power in appropriate situations in order to act as a deterrent and maintain peace. Contention 1, military power is necessary for certain situations. Although diplomacy can be effective, military power is necessary for situations that words cannot fix. Take our relations with North Korea and their recent nuclear activity. North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un's penchant for Hollywood movies or attraction is unlikely to affect his decision on developing nuclear weapons. It's clear it hasn't, considering that North Korea is a nuclear threat to many countries now. In fact, hard power might just dissuade him, particularly if China agreed to economic sanctions. Subpoint A, non-state actors. Diplomacy still might work better in terms of war, but in terms of terrorism and when non-state actors come into play, diplomacy has never worked with terrorism and non-state actors. An example of this is a campaign against Taliban in Afghanistan. The aim was to dismantle al-Qaeda and deny it a safe base of operations in Afghanistan by removing the Taliban from power. This could not be efficiently done through diplomacy, so overwhelming military force was needed to reach this goal. Another prominent example is the Israel-Palestine conflict, which was a conflict over control of land and borders. Hamas, a part of the Palestinian government, even tried to diplomatically discuss the conflict with the U.S., but the U.S. refused to deal with Hamas because of the fact that it had militant wings that commit acts of terrorism. As a result of ineffective diplomacy, Hamas started suicide bombing Israel, which made the situation even worse. As indicated by the empirical evidence above, in situations like the situation with Iraq, diplomacy may not work, which is where military intervention is needed to effectively solve the conflict to mitigate indirect harms to other countries and maintain peace. Contention 2, military power acts as a deterrent. The fact that military power acts as a deterrent prevents countries from attacking each other and therefore maintains peace. When military power acts as a deterrent, it is called mutually assured destruction. Essentially, the full-scale use of strong nuclear weapons from both sides leads to a complete destruction of both sides, which results in a stalemate where both sides decide not to act but stay armed. This is especially exhibited in the Cold War, where America held the upper hand in regards to nuclear superiority. By the late 1950s, the Soviet Union had built a convincing arsenal that could be harmful. In the end, the superpowers refrained from attacking each other because of the certainty of mutually assured destruction. Moreover, in the past, a lot of countries used to attack Israel. Now that it has one of the most capable militaries, there has been a lot less conflict between Israel and other countries. Today, our military power has clearly deterred North Korea, Iran, and the Middle East from making nuclear weapons which could be harmful. Thus, the fact that military power acts as a deterrent prevents other countries from let alone using military intervention. Think about their actions and the consequences, and if the impacts are worth the cost of war. This, in turn, preserves peace between countries who might have tension between them. In the final analysis, what really matters in this debate is resolving conflict in the most efficient way possible with minimal harms. The use of military power in order to rectify an issue is the most effective way, as if it is utilized in a situation that diplomacy cannot be successful in. It conveys the idea of the country and may even persuade the opposing force to come to the table and allow the country to implement diplomacy to solve the situation. Military power can also act as a deterrent and avoid conflict without using any more power or resources at all. This, in turn, benefits the people affected by the decisions of world leaders. Since military power solves situations with non-state actors effectively and acts as a deterrent, we and you should as well affirm resolved. Military diplomacy has better maintained peace than military power. We strongly urge a con ballot. Thank you.
Cross-sex starts now.
So you've given examples of how like soft power hasn't been used effectively when dealing with ISIS, correct?
Not necessarily ISIS, just terrorism and non-state
Terrorism
actors.
in general, I understand. But how has military power helped, for example, ISIS or any other terrorists?
What do you
that
mean?
Mentioned. So you've given examples of how soft power isn't effective, but how is hard power effective? Can you give a summary of how hard power is used effectively in these examples?
So, and these are examples of soft power not being effective, but hard power can be effective because you can't just negotiate with terrorists. Like, it doesn't work.
But you haven't shown any evidence for that. Do you have
Our
any
evidence for the fact that soft power doesn't work with terrorists.
No, I understand
is
that, but that's
like
not
the
my
campaign
question.
against Taliban in Afghanistan.
But my question is, do you have any evidence showing that hard power would work
Would work against what?
against any examples that you just gave?
Well, no, because this was I do have evidence for that, but this was evidence for
But I'm
for
talking
soft
about,
power not working.
I understand that, but I'm asking about hard power.
Hard power working with terrorism.
Yes.
Right. So basically, hard power would be more effective in working with terrorists because soft power is just simply ineffective. Like, you can't use that.
Well, I understand. Okay, moving on. You mentioned about the Cold War, right? How the mad theory showed that, like, because they're both afraid, no one got hurt, right?
Yes.
But did you know about the proxy wars that occurred because of the Cold War?
No. What is your evidence?
So one of them is the Korean War. So the Cold War was the big one that caused a lot of other proxy wars, and the Korean War
What
killed
was the
over.
cause of the proxy wars? I just want to clarify, so we understand this.
It's the Cold War. I have evidence for it. That
How did the Cold War cause proxy wars? Like,
I'm not exactly sure, but okay.
Time.
Partner ready? Judge ready?
Yes.
Opponents ready?
yes.
Okay, time starts now. First, I would like to go back and refute all of their contentions, and then, if time permits, go back and strengthen and reiterate our case. So they say that 225,000 people were killed in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and while we agree that that is a very large amount of people, and that's a horrible statistic to have in the world, the nuclear bomb has been used once by one country, and that's it. And military deterrence has prevented nuclear bombs from being used. The Cold War being an example, when the United States and Russia were pointing nukes at each other, they didn't use it for fear of mass destruction. They also say that that diplomacy uses attraction instead of violence. But as my partner said in her opening case, attraction to one country's culture isn't going to change the military buildup of another person. They would still be doing the same thing. And going into their first contention, they say that the diplomacy is much more effective, but diplomacy has never worked empirically in any situation with non-state actors, which means that military power is needed in cases such as this. They say that we don't have any examples, but as my partner stated in her opening case, Al-Qaeda with the Taliban, that was a prime example of how military power has been used to stop non-state actors and where diplomacy has failed. They also say that diplomacy is risk-free, but that's not the case. The Marshall Plan caused billions of dollars. And in fact, diplomacy during war only ever prolongs the conflict because of the time it takes because of the long amounts of time that diplomacy takes to reach a conclusion. They also say that diplomacy is the better form because it has worked more time, but in fact, but rather we have an example we have a statistic that says that diplomacy, and especially noting coercive diplomacy, has only worked 32% of the time, while military power has worked 72% of the time. Now, Judge, I ask you, would you rather have a plan that works 72% of the time or a plan that works 32% of the time? Our opponents also directly admitted in cross-checks that they had no evidence and, quote-unquote, weren't exactly sure how the Cold War caused proxy wars, which means that they have not proven that there is actually a correlation between the two. Now, going back to our own case, our two contentions were military deterrence and and non-state actors, which non-state actors being that, again, diplomacy has not worked in a situation with non-state actors, and military deterrence is what keeps us safe. Military deterrence is what prevents two countries from completely destroying each other, and that is why military power maintains peace better than diplomacy. For these reasons, I urge a con ballot. Thank you.
Captain?
Yeah, you can run it.
Yeah.
Oh, wait.
Actually, no.
It's cross-ex, right?
Yeah.
Cross-sex prep?
Okay.
Go there, bud. Wait for me. Cross-sex starts now.
So you said that there's 32% of the time military power did not work,
Yes.
and 72% of the time it did work. Where did you get this statistic?
This was by Robert J. Art, and he is a professor at MIT.
Can you restate the example of her example of the hard power that worked instead of soft power?
Of course, let me just get it real quick.
Hard power.
Yeah, the Al-Qaeda Taliban example.
I gave that to you.
No, you didn't.
This one.
Okay. An example of this is the campaign against Taliban in Afghanistan. The aim was to dismantle Al-Qaeda and to deny it a safe base from operations in Afghanistan. By removing the Taliban, do you want me to just give the card to you so you can read it? It's kind of long.
No, can you please
Okay.
summarize it? Or
So basically, they were trying to remove the Taliban from power, and you can't do that with diplomacy, so military power had to be used to come in and get rid of them.
so, but they use military power like bombings or
Military force.
force?
Yes.
Okay. So you said that after World War II there was never a nuclear bombing ever again. Right?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Well, we believe that the reason of this is actually because of diplomacy.
Right. So could
So
you
that
elaborate
is
on
an
that?
example, a huge example that diplomacy is actually effective. Do you agree?
I'm sorry. Not without any context, I can't agree to what you're saying.
What do you mean?
Like, you're not giving me any examples. You're not giving me a correlation between the two. You're just saying diplomacy has worked, but how? That's what I need. That's what I need for me to be able to agree with you, if possible.
Okay, so do you have any examples that hard power has worked?
Well, there hasn't been a nuclear bombing since, and we have evidence that shows the correlation between arms and military deterrence and the fact that military deterrence and the fact that nukes haven't been used.
Right. In this debate, there are some serious flaws in our opponent's case. First of all, they have used many examples that soft power does not work. However, there is little evidence showing how hard power is effective. Therefore, their argument is mostly invalid. For example, they have stated that we have been trying to use diplomacy to solve the conflict with North Korea, and that it has not worked. However, they have not shown why we haven't used hard power against North Korea, and if hard power would have worked against North Korea in this conflict against North Korea. Also, one of their contentions was MAD, which was mutually assured destruction. One of their contentions was that we can use threats and create peace. However, North Korea is currently using threats, saying that they have a lot of nuclear power in their country. However, this is causing a lot of conflict. So this is contradicting their own point. They've also mentioned the Cold War, and this is actually proving our point, because the Cold War, according to the United States Institute of Peace, was actually an example of coercive diplomacy, which is what we are supporting. Also, they have said that the reason that there hasn't been nuclear bombing since World War II, and are arguing that this is because of military power. However, this is actually because of the Marshall Plan, which is a form of diplomacy and is supporting our case. So, because of this, we have shown that the opponents have a lot to resolve before moving on with the debate. So that, therefore, we urge a pro ballot.
So could you elaborate more on your point about North Korea
I'm
and
saying-
how we haven't proven with military power that it hasn't happened? Anyway, just could you elaborate
So, wait, I'm just making sure your argument was that diplomacy would not
more?
work.
I'm sorry, I'm the one asking you.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay. So
So could
I'm
you just
basically
elaborate
saying
on what
that
you said?
you guys have said that North Korea, diplomacy would not work in a conflict such as North Korea's, right?
No, I believe we specifically stated that diplomacy would not work with non-state actors and those unwilling to talk.
So
If you
that-
choose to lump North Korea into those that do not wish to talk, then yes.
yeah, but you guys did say something about North Korea.
Right, but
What was your
that-
argument?
I'm sorry, could you just please answer my question?
Hey, so I was saying that North Korea, you haven't proven that that hard power would work against North Korea.
And would you agree that conflict hasn't escalated enough between the United States and North Korea to use any sort of power?
No.
Okay, so where would be an example that diplomacy has been used with North Korea from the United States, where it has worked?
I didn't say that diplomacy worked.
I know, but I'm asking you. Is
So-
there an example?
I don't know. Probably not.
You also said the Marshall Plan was an example of, was the reason why there's no nuclear bomb being used?
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit more on on what the Marshall Plan entailed?
Well, it was an agreement between countries to solve the economic problems that were made in.
So you think that the nuclear bombs are an economic problem?
Well, it might not be, but the agreement, the Marshall Plan definitely improved countries' relations.
Time.
I'm ready.
Ready?
So, partner ready? Partner ready?
Oh yeah.
Opponents ready?
Yes.
Yep. Judge ready?
Yes, sir. Time starts now.
Essentially, what has happened in this debate is the opponents have falsely accused us of many things. Originally, they stated that it is true that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were terrible, but it only happened once. They're in essence dismissing the fact that over 220,000 people were killed when using hard power. And they keep trying to argue that soft power doesn't work in these situations, but they haven't provided any evidence showing that hard power does. So they just keep making claims and attacking our defense without using their own evidence. Also, they said that attraction wouldn't work in these situations, but there's no proof that attraction wouldn't work because no one has ever tried it. They've only tried hard power, but that hasn't worked. And they're saying that that diplomacy wouldn't work here, but they're not showing any evidence for that. Also, they're saying that the Marshall Plan didn't actually help, but the Marshall Plan, if the U.S. didn't use the Marshall Plan, then Europe would have fallen under the communist Soviet Union, and Europe would have been destroyed completely. So the Marshall Plan was necessary, and that was just undoing the effects of hard power in the first place. Also, they said that the MAD theory is the only reason we're safe to prevent countries from attacking each other. But if you don't use military power in the first place, then everyone will be safe anyway. So evidently we've shown that the opponents have a lot to resolve before moving on with this debate. For these reasons, we urge a pro ballot.
Partner ready? Opposition ready?
Yep.
Judge ready?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. My time will begin now. All right. So the first thing they say that against our case is that we gave many examples of soft power not working, but we gave no examples of hard power being effective. Actually, we gave a very prominent example of hard power being effective, as I keep on reiterating, the campaign against Taliban in Afghanistan. The aim was to dismantle al-Qaeda and deny it a safe base of operations in Afghanistan by removing the Taliban from power. So, since this could not be done through diplomacy, this is where we used our military, and this is where it worked. They also say that we have not shown why we have not used military power against North Korea. And North Korea is just a hypothetical situation. We don't know what will happen in the future. But we do know that diplomacy is not going to be effective with North Korea and non-state actors. They also mention that the Cold War proves their point, an example of coercive diplomacy, which they don't really elaborate on throughout their case, coercive diplomacy, what it means. They didn't really give any evidence of this or elaborate at all, and so therefore that is also invalid. They also said that the Marshall Plan was effective, but the Marshall Plan actually didn't help in terms of the nuclear bombs that were used. And they also said that without military power, people would be safe anyway. So more people would be safe from ISIS, because is that what they're saying? Because diplomacy cannot be used toward terrorism, as we already stated. So since our contentions are still standing strong, we strongly urge a con ballot. Thank you.
So, Judge, it is evident that we won because our opponents have given numerous examples of how diplomacy will not work in certain situations, but have given little example of how hard power does work. The only example they have given is about about Taliban, which is one example, but this proves that a lot of their other evidence is completely invalid. So, for example, the North Korea evidence that they brought up. They also said that the Marshall Plan was useless, but it actually helped rebuild Europe and prevent it from falling under a communist Soviet Union. So, in fact, this is one example when soft power was actually used effectively. The Marshall Plan was also used to fix the economic problems of war, which is a form of hard power, showing that war can cause many economic problems in our world and create conflict. They've also talked about MAD, which is mutually assured destruction, and saying that it is very useful and avoid conflicts. However, North Korea is basically using threats that is very similar to MAD, and it is causing a lot of conflict in our world. So, Judge, ask yourself this. Do you really want to vote for the opponents who, if you really think about it, have only addressed one good example of how hard power works over soft power? For these reasons, we strongly urge a con ballot. A pro ballot.
Judge, ready?
Yes.
Okay. Time starts now. In a pro world, people would be living in danger from terrorists and other actors such as dictators because our opponents refuse to believe that military power is a good way to solve problems. In fact, without military power, without the use of military power, 32,765 people would be killed from problems that could not be solved by diplomacy, problems like terrorism and dictatorships. In the con world, however, military power acts as a deterrent and is successful in situations that diplomacy cannot fix, which creates a more peaceful world with a higher level of satisfaction. It is also worth noting that the opponents have not countered any of our claims that soft power has not worked. So although we only have one example, albeit a good one that is a representative of most other examples of terrorism and non-state actors, they do not have any examples of this working. They state that the Marshall Plan worked, and yes, we agree that the Marshall Plan worked in Europe, but it didn't. But in the first case, what they said was that the Marshall Plan worked in stopping nuclear bombs, but that's not what happened. What happened was that nuclear bombs are no longer being used because of military deterrence, because countries do not want mass destruction. They do not want to annihilate each other, and this is because of military destruction and not because of the Marshall Plan, as they stated. So diplomacy only ever prolongs war. Diplomacy only works 32% of the time. Diplomacy has not worked in any situation with non-state actors, where military power has a much higher success rate. So let me end with this, Judge. Would you rather live in a world where peace is maintained through military power, or would you rather live in a world where diplomacy is tried, failed, and then chaos ensues? For all these reasons, I urge a con ballot. Thank you.
What?
She is.
Good job. Good job. Great debate. Yeah, great job.
All right.